over $60 million on an Arrive scam app that we didn't need, didn't work, sent 10,000 people erroneously into quarantine, losing income.
The ArriveCan app that no one uses and doesn't work, all at a time when Canadians are struggling with their groceries and their rent.
We take the obligation to manage taxpayers' money very seriously. Under no circumstances would we condone what the Auditor General determined to be contracting practices that did not follow the rules, and anybody who didn't will be held to account.
Absolutely.
Just a sampling of the back and forth between the opposition and government as the Auditor General delivers her report into the ArriveCan app. It was a COVID-era app designed to help with the flow of border travel, but it became a big controversy with a ballooning bottom line. The app's original cost estimate was $80,000. Its final price tag, nearly $60 million. And the Auditor General says the paper trail is so absent that even that may not be the final number. Here to unpack the potential political cost is our front bench, former senior advisor to the Liberal Ontario governments of Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne. Dan Moulton is here. He's now a partner with Crestview Strategy. Shakir Chambers worked in Prime Minister Stephen Harper's office before becoming a policy advisor to the International Trade Minister. He's now a principal at Earnscliffe Strategies. Kathleen Monk is the former director of communications to the late Jack Layton. She's now the principal owner of Monk and Associates. And Laura Stone rounds us out. She's a Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. Kathleen, I'll start with you. I thought the report was incredibly detailed today and certainly led to, the Conservatives are calling it an Arrive scam. The government is defending itself, saying it was very quick, it was a busy time, it was a lot of pressure. We've rectified, in hindsight, we could have done better. Do you think there is a political cost to what came out today?
There is a political cost, and it's because we are now playing on a political terrain that is beneficial to the Conservatives. Because it's on the question of corruption, on a scandal, on possible, poor ethics in terms of how it was implemented. That always plays to the Conservative strength. And you even heard it in the language and the branding they're using on this scandal. They're calling it Arrive scam, reminiscent, of course, of Ad Scam, which was the sponsorship scandal of the early 2000s that frankly brought down the Paul Martin government. And so it's the repetition of the scandal, even though the Auditor General was very clear that she doesn't know if there's criminal wrongdoing, and that she's leaving that and she's leaving that up to the RCMP. But there's all these whiffs of different things that are happening. Last week at committee, the committee abruptly shut down because committee members were concerned that they were kind of going into the issue that would impact the investigation. So there's a lot of unanswered questions, but just the idea that it's another scam, it's another scandal, it's going to help the Conservatives.
I guess what I wonder in this case, Laura, is, let's say best case scenario, it's just high-level incompetence. The Auditor General herself did not impugn specific members of Parliament or ministers specifically, but what was missing clearly was oversight. Ultimately, is that a vulnerability for the federal government, or is there the potential for Canadians to tune it out because she isn't calling out any specific names?
I think it's a vulnerability for a federal government that's already struggling. I don't think this is going to be the ballot box issue in the next election. I remember that ArriveCan app, and I'm so mad that it cost $60 million, although that will resonate with people, and they'll think back to that time in COVID and say, what? That was $60 million or more? How is that possible, and where did the money go? It doesn't smell right, and I think that does resonate with people, but I think it has more of a cumulative effect for the Liberal government that's already struggling on affordability and housing issues. They've got a lot on their plate right now. This just adds to it. And I do find it interesting that both the Conservatives and the NDP had basically the similar lines of attack today, which was the government wasted all your money. You can barely afford groceries. Can you believe this? So they're clearly going after the Liberals where they're already vulnerable.
That's a good point, Dan, that both of the opposition's sort of critique of the government on this were very similar and very much informed by the current economic climate and kind of the cost of living crisis. What do you think the strategy is there? And ultimately, how do you think the Liberals should counter it?
Well, I think certainly let's first talk about the cost here. Is there a political cost is the question you raise, and I think there is a great deal of opportunity cost for the government. Laura's right. This is a government that's spending too much of its time on defense and not enough time on offense. They're having to explain the story here as to why this app cost this much. If they're explaining, they're losing, as we all know in the old adage of politics. And so I think the government's losing opportunity to turn the sort of tide around here. We've seen some positive efforts from the Prime Minister as recent as Friday to try and get back on the front foot, to try and be articulating a positive political message about why Liberals should be re-elected to government. And the more time they're forced to explain why it was necessary to digitize the arrivals process for foreign nationals into Canada, the less time they're able to get back on that front footing. I do think it's a bit ironic to hear Pierre Poilievre go on about outsourcing in government. Conservatives spend a lot of time talking about how government should operate more like private sector entities. And this is a pretty private sector approach. So it's, I think, a little ironic for him to be going on that line of attack, but smart of he and Jagmeet Singh to be tying it to the affordability crisis of waste. I think that's sort of, the more they can get the government talking about this, the less time the government has to be talking about its positive message. And that's good for the Conservatives and the New Democrats.
I feel like I always wonder as well with stuff like this, when it comes to the amount of money, Shakir, how, we always use that famous orange juice example, like stuff that people can conceptualize, they get really upset about. Is this in that neighborhood, do you think?
Yeah, I think for sure when you talk about the ballooning factor of this, right, from 80K to 60 million, I think that upsets a lot of people. I think there's a lot of folks out there that already think, they're taxed too much and the government misspends their tax dollars. So this falls right into that narrative of, just government mismanagement. I think if you're the Liberals, there are folks who are either on the fence of whether they should support the Liberals or, just are not going to support them anyways. And I think for those folks, they probably priced in this notion of this government just added to the pile of, mismanagement and issues they've had over the years. So it won't be a long-term issue. But I think if you're Pierre Poilievre of the Conservatives, what you can take from this is Pierre Poilievre always talks about cutting government waste. And every time he says that, whether it's the media or a QP, they always say, so what would you cut? I think now he has a specific example he can always point to and say, remember that ArriveCan app? Remember that $60 million the government misspent? Well, I'll get rid of that and spend it in a better way or get more value for money. So I think it just gives him more of a specific to kind of point to when he's trying to point to his narrative about like balancing the budget and cutting government waste moving forward. But I think ultimately the legs on this are probably pretty short, but he can probably reactivate audiences come election time. Remember this waste that we had with ArriveCan.
Yeah, he does certainly point to that as an example, and it makes sense. The only sort of caveat I would add is that the money's already been spent. It's not part of a line item going forward that will help balance the budget, but I do take your point. I want to switch gears because I also want to get everyone to weigh in on the comments from Donald Trump over the weekend. I'm going to play them for our audience, and then we'll discuss. Have a listen.
One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay.
So that is Donald Trump, former president, likely GOP presidential nominee. Kathleen, the warnings about defense spending to NATO allies are nothing new, and certainly we covered the ups and downs of that throughout his presidency. But the line about encouraging Russia essentially to invade those allies, is what's generated a ton of reaction today.
It was startling over the weekend. And then, in fact, his senators in many ways have doubled down and said, yeah, that's Trump. His Republican senators, I should say, and supporters are saying, yeah, that's Trump. Trump's just ringing the bell, putting everybody on notice. But this is what Trump does, right? Trump actually has called for the economy to crash under Biden. He wants the economy to crash because he wants to anything just to serve him well. I mean, yeah, there's much made over the last, say, 48, 72 hours of Biden's gaffe on Thursday night and his mental acuity, if you will. But all politicians make gaffes. The difference is, even Trump made a gaffe recently around Nikki Haley. But the difference is Trump is facing 91 felony counts. He encourages Russia to attack allies, friends. He encourages the economy to crash. This is not somebody that the Americans can afford to have as their president.
And I take your point that it seems like when you bring up, relatively speaking, Laura, both of those examples, I think that's, Canadians are pretty in agreement over a lot of the options. But it's clear that Americans are not, right? Like if you look at some of the polling, the portion even of Democrats who are worried about the mental acuity of Joe Biden following that special counsel report or following some of those gaffes is similarly in line with the number of the general electorate that is worried about the indictments that Donald Trump faces. What does that say to you?
It says to me that Canadians need to prepare for the very real possibility of another term of President Trump. And I think we've seen the Liberal government try to capitalize on this in their comparisons of Pierre Poilievre to Donald Trump, certainly kind of this new Russia angle and Russia's relationship with Ukraine and the Conservatives here's relationship with Ukraine, I think will almost serve as I don't want to call it a gift because it's sinister, but I think the Liberals will use that to their advantage. It shows a very divided country. We always talk about how divided the United States is, but it's even more so now. And I think this will have severe repercussions around the world and certainly in Canada when it comes to Canada's relationship with the United States, but domestically as well, and how the Liberal government is going to try to use this in order to get under Pierre Poilievre's skin.
Right. Let me just quickly play the defense minister responding to what Donald Trump said, and then Dan and Shakir, I'll get you both in.
I don't agree with that message. I work very closely with the United States, and I can tell you of their unwavering commitment. Secretary of Defense Austin, our conversations with President Biden, it's very clear that they remain resolutely in support of NATO.
Just got about a minute left for each of you, but Dan, if you're sitting in the federal government right now, what do? Do you ignore it? Do you respond to it? What would your advice be on how to handle this stuff?
Well, there isn't very much they can do. I think engaging in this conversation can only serve to inflame relations with the United States and a potential future Trump presidency. I think we've seen the government pull back from its more direct responses or direct, even attacks on Pierre Poilievre, inciting using the word MAGA. I mean, they've moved away from that, and I think that's responsible. I imagine Laura's right. They're going to make political hay of this where they can, but I think what they'll do in the Prime Minister's office more than anything else is emphasize their stewardship through the first Trump presidency, the work they did to stabilize for the long term NAFTA and our trade relationships with the United States, and really how well off Canada came out of that, all things considered. And so I think they'll try and emphasize their experience in managing a Trump presidency and their preparedness to do it again.
Dan's point, I think, Shakir, is a salient one. There's so much less of the MAGA critique right now from the government as it seems more and more realistic that Donald Trump will be that nominee.
Yeah, and I think they realize that Trump takes things very personally, right? Using that MAGA brand to attack your chief opposition probably won't play well if he becomes president. So I think the Liberals have internalized that message and they're staying away from that. I think just on Donald Trump and NATO, though, the one thing I would say is if you listen to that clip, Donald Trump knows his audience, right? That audience didn't boo. They weren't surprised by that comment. They applauded what he said, right? So they cheered what he said. So he knows his audience. He knows who he's talking to, and he plays it up over and over again. The one thing I would say about U.S. foreign policy, though, it tends to stay pretty consistent no matter who's in office. So Donald Trump can play to that base. I suspect if he's in office, NATO is one of those things where I'm not so sure he's just going to pull out of NATO or even encourage Russia to invade its allies, despite his rhetoric to his audience.
I mean, I guess fingers crossed. I don't know. What a weird world we live in. Yeah. Thanks, guys. Appreciate the discussion. Our wonderful front bench: Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, Kathleen Mugg, and Laura Stone. I'm going to take a quick break.